My brother-in-law called me a consultant at the holiday party. Not to my face. To the mayor's deputy director, whose hand I had just shaken across a buffet table at the Whitmore Hotel in downtown Raleigh, while I was standing close enough to hear every word. He said it like it settled something, like the word consultant was a box he'd been looking for and finally found a use for. The deputy director nodded and moved on. My brother-in-law caught my eye for exactly half a second, then turned toward the bar. That was December. By March, I understood what the word had actually meant. My name is Garrett Foley. I'm 54 years old. For 17 years, I ran field and contract operations for Ellison Mechanical and Electrical out of Raleigh, North Carolina. Not as an owner, not with equity, but in every way that actually mattered: in the bid rooms, on the job sites, in the offices of every facilities director and procurement coordinator in Wake, Durham, and Johnston counties. I was Ellison. I need to back up. I married my wife 22 years ago. She grew up in Cary, youngest of three. Her father, Don Ellison, had been running a mechanical and electrical contracting outfit since the late 80s. 15 employees, a handful of commercial HVAC accounts, and a reputation that was respectable without being remarkable. He was good at the handshake side of the business. Genuinely good. He remembered birthdays, showed up at funerals, knew which project managers preferred a phone call over an email. What he wasn't good at, what he'd never been particularly interested in, was the operational side. Scheduling, labor cost tracking, bid analysis, compliance documentation, the part of the business that determined whether you actually made money on a job or just got busy doing it. My father-in-law offered me a position managing field operations about 6 months after the wedding. I'd spent 4 years at a mid-sized general contractor in Charlotte, mostly doing project coordination and cost estimating. I said yes because my wife thought it made sense, and because I genuinely believed I could help. Within 2 years, I had restructured Ellison's labor scheduling system from scratch, renegotiated the majority of the subcontractor agreements, and put together the company's first formal bid template, the kind of documentation that made the difference between winning public contracts and watching the same 3 competitors take everything. We landed our first county contract in year 3, a mechanical upgrade project at a school complex in Garner. Modest scope, but the relationships it opened were not modest at all. By year 7, Ellison had 41 employees and a full commercial HVAC division. By year 12, we were consistently among the top 3 mechanical and electrical contractors bidding on public school and municipal projects across the Triangle. The year I turned 50, we held active contracts with the county school system, the city of Raleigh, and a 10-year service agreement with the State Facilities Management Office worth just under $6 million annually. My father-in-law gave me the title of Director of Operations somewhere around year 9. No ownership stake, no formal equity conversation. A title and a salary that reflected what a good operations manager made in 2017, not what a person who had functionally rebuilt an entire company should have been earning by 2023. I raised it once, about 4 years into the title. He said he appreciated everything I did and that we'd revisit the structure soon. We didn't revisit it, but I understood something about the position I was in. I understood it in the way you understand a thing you've decided to accept. You see it clearly. You just choose not to look at it too directly for too long. My father-in-law was the owner. My wife was his daughter. I was the son-in-law who ran the operation. That arrangement had a ceiling, and the ceiling was determined by biology, not performance. I told myself the work was enough. For most of those 17 years, I almost believed it. Then my brother-in-law finished his MBA. My wife's brother, Marcus, was 34. He'd spent 5 years in Atlanta working in financial consulting, the kind of work that involves a lot of PowerPoint slides and very few decisions with physical consequences. He was smart, in an abstract way, confident in the specific manner of someone who has never been made to answer for a concrete mistake. He came back to Raleigh in the spring talking about scalable growth frameworks and market positioning, and my father-in-law started having lunch with him twice a week. I noticed. I didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have created a problem I didn't want to create. I just watched, and I kept working. In October, my father-in-law asked me to brief Marcus on the state facilities contract, the renewal cycle, the performance documentation requirements, the key contacts at the state office. I did it, thoroughly. Spent 3 afternoons walking him through the reporting structure, the compliance calendar, the escalation procedures for service calls. Marcus took notes and asked questions that were mostly reasonable, even if they were also the questions of someone learning a language from a phrase book rather than someone who actually spoke it. I told myself my father-in-law was being responsible, building redundancy into the operation, making sure institutional knowledge wasn't concentrated in one person. That's what good management does. Then came November. My father-in-law called a company meeting on a Wednesday morning. Full staff office, field supervisors, project managers. We met in the warehouse at our main facility off Capitol Boulevard, standing in a loose semicircle around a portable whiteboard he'd dragged out from the back office. He thanked everyone for a strong fiscal year, said the company was in excellent shape, said he'd been thinking hard about the future of Ellison Mechanical and what the next chapter needed to look like. Then he announced that Marcus would be stepping into the role of Director of Operations, effective the first of the year, full operational authority. Decision-making responsibility across field and contract divisions. No phone call the night before, no conversation in the hallway. My father-in-law looked in my direction once, briefly, with an expression I recognized the expression of a person who has already decided something and is now simply informing you of the weather. I asked what my role would be going forward. He said he saw me in an advisory capacity, helping Marcus get comfortable, leveraging my relationships with clients. He used the word consultant again. I heard it differently this time. There were 23 people in that warehouse, field guys I'd hired, project managers I'd put through their licensing, a scheduler named Denise who'd been with me for 9 years and knew our job calendar better than anyone alive. She didn't look at me. Nobody did, except for one of the senior electricians, a guy named Wendell, 48 years old, who'd been with Ellison since before I arrived, who caught my eye for a second with an expression that said everything and nothing at the same time. I stayed through the rest of the meeting, nodded at the appropriate moments, shook Marcus's hand afterward, drove back to the main office, closed my door, sat down at my desk. On the corner of my desk was a 3-ring binder, dark blue, the cover worn at the edges from years of being picked up and set down. I'd put it together in year 2 and updated it every quarter since. Inside it was everything. Contact sheets for every county procurement coordinator, every school facilities director, every state office contract manager I'd worked with over 17 years. Notes on each one, what they responded to, what annoyed them, how they communicated, what they needed from a contractor to feel confident in a relationship. Renewal cycles dated out 2 and 3 years. Bid strategy notes on upcoming projects I'd heard about through relationships Marcus didn't have yet and didn't know to look for. None of it was on the company server. I'd been maintaining it manually since the beginning, long before Ellison had any real digital infrastructure. It had never occurred to anyone to ask me to upload it somewhere. It had never occurred to me to volunteer. My wife called that evening. She'd already spoken with her father. She was quiet in a specific way, not the quiet of someone who didn't know what to say, but the quiet of someone who'd already had the argument and come out of it without a win. She said she was sorry. She said she didn't agree with how it was handled. I told her I wasn't going anywhere immediately, that I needed some time to think. What I didn't tell her was that the thinking had already started. I spent 4 days working from home. I told the office I had a project I was developing quietly, which was true. I sat at the kitchen table with the blue binder open in front of me and went through it page by page, not from nostalgia, but from the specific focus of someone taking inventory of what they actually own. On the 3rd day, I found what I was looking for, or rather, I confirmed what I had already suspected but had never needed to think about directly. The state facilities management contract. The one worth $6 million a year. I had negotiated it personally, in 2 stages, over the course of 18 months. I had the original draft correspondence on my personal laptop, sent from my personal email before Ellison had transitioned to a company address system. More importantly, the contract itself, which I pulled up through the state's public procurement portal, listed me by name as the primary point of contact for performance compliance. Not Ellison Mechanical, not my father-in-law, me, my direct line, my professional credentials as a certified project manager, which I had earned on my own time and maintained on my own dime. There was also a clause in the county school system master service agreement, the one covering 42 school facilities across Wake County, which I had renewed twice, that specified any change in primary contract management personnel required written notice to the county's facilities office, no fewer than 60 days prior to the change taking effect. I had written that clause myself during the 2nd renewal negotiation. I'd done it to protect Ellison's client relationship from disruption. I hadn't thought about what it meant from the other direction. I read both documents carefully. Then I thought about something else. 6 years ago, I had built a project management and compliance tracking system for Ellison's public contract work. The state and county contracts had specific documentation requirements, service logs, inspection records, response time certifications, and we'd been managing them manually, which meant we were perpetually behind and occasionally out of compliance. I spent 8 months building a tracking system in a software platform I licensed on my personal account. using my own laptop, on evenings and weekends. When I brought it into the operation, it reduced our compliance documentation time by roughly 60% and had directly contributed to our contract renewal scores improving enough to make us competitive for the state facilities agreement in the first place. I had never assigned that system to Ellison. It had never come up. My original employment agreement was a 4-page document that my father-in-law's accountant had drawn up adequate for hiring an operations manager in 2006, completely silent on intellectual property developed outside of working hours on personal equipment. Nobody had ever thought to update it. I sat with that information for a full day before I did anything with it. I want to be clear about the state I was in, because it would be easy to make it sound like I was calculating and cold. I wasn't. I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Tired of being the person whose name appeared in every contract that mattered and on no wall that anyone saw. Tired of understanding, in my quiet and practical way, that I was the architecture of something I would never be allowed to own. I thought about a man named Paul Briggs. Paul ran Cornerstone Building Systems out of Durham. We'd been on opposite sides of a dozen bids over the years, competitive, never hostile. He was the kind of contractor who ran a clean operation, good labor relations, strong compliance record, the reputation of someone who did what he said he would do. About 2 years earlier, at an Associated Builders and Contractors event at the convention center, he'd pulled me aside and said something I had filed away and mostly forgotten. "Garrett, I don't know what your situation looks like over there, but if it ever changes, I'd want to have that conversation before anyone else does." I hadn't responded. Out of loyalty, out of the routine of it, out of the belief that the people you build something for will eventually recognize what was built and act accordingly. I called Paul on a Thursday morning. He picked up on the second ring and said, without any particular drama, "Took you long enough." We met 2 days later at a breakfast place in North Durham booths. Bad lighting, good coffee, the kind of place where nobody was performing anything for anyone. Paul was in his early 60s, direct in his manner, with the specific patience of someone who has been in the trades long enough to know that the people who talk the most during a negotiation are usually the ones who need the deal more. He asked good questions. Not general questions, specific ones. He asked about my compliance tracking methodology. He asked how I managed multi-year contract relationships with procurement offices that turned over staff every few years. He asked what I thought the Triangle Market's biggest institutional client need was that nobody was currently meeting well. He listened to the answers. The offer was $210,000 base, profit participation on public contract wins, Senior Vice President of Public Operations overseeing a team of 12 that included project managers, compliance coordinators, and field supervisors. His words at the end of the meeting were the ones that stayed with me on the drive back. "Whatever systems you've built on your own time, on your own equipment, we have a formal process for that. You get credited. Your name goes on the work." I drove home thinking about the tracking system sitting on my personal laptop. I thought about 17 years of compliance documentation that had kept Ellison's contracts clean. I thought about a salary that had not changed materially in 5 years, while the company's public contract revenue had grown by 40%. My wife was in the kitchen when I got home. We sat across from each other at the table for a long time. She said something that I think she had been holding for a while, maybe for years. She said, "My father is a good man who built a good business. You turned it into a real company. Those are not the same thing, and he has never once said thank you for the difference." I told her I was going to call Paul back in the morning. She said, "I know. I've known for about a week." I called Paul, told him I was in. We agreed on a start date 6 weeks out. That afternoon I typed my resignation. 2 weeks notice, professional. Nothing unnecessary on the page. I printed it on plain paper from my home printer. I had one more thing to do before I delivered it. I opened my laptop and drafted 3 letters. One to the County School Systems Facilities Director, one to the State Office Contract Manager, one to the City of Raleigh's Procurement Coordinator. Each letter was formal and straightforward. I informed them that I would be leaving Ellison Mechanical and Electrical at the end of the month, that my contact information was changing, and that going forward I could be reached through Cornerstone Building Systems in Durham. I included Paul's company address and main line. I noted that I would be personally overseeing public sector operations in my new capacity and looked forward to maintaining the working relationships we'd built. Under the terms of the county school contract, I was obligated, literally required by the language of the agreement, to provide 60 days written notice of a change in primary contract management. I was fulfilling that obligation. Nothing more, nothing less. I sent all 3 letters, then drove to my father-in-law's office. He was reviewing bid documents when I knocked. He waved me in without looking up. finished what he was reading, then leaned back in his chair the way he always did when he had already decided how a conversation was going to go. I put the letter on his desk. He read it, looked up, said, 2 weeks. 2 weeks, I said. He asked where I was going. I told him Cornerstone. He was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they're adding numbers in their head and not liking the sum. He asked if we could talk about a different structure, maybe a client relations role, something that kept me connected to the accounts. I told him Paul had made a full offer, that I'd accepted it, and that the start date was set. He said Cornerstone was paying over market. I told him that was between me and them. Then he said, I hope this doesn't make things difficult for your wife. I looked at him for a moment. She and I have talked it through. We're in agreement. He said he hoped I understood that everything I'd contributed to Ellison had been valued. I said, Don, you gave Marcus my title. In a warehouse. In front of the people I hired. That was the conversation about value. I walked out before he finished the sentence he started. The next 2 weeks were the particular kind of strange that happens when a chapter is ending, and everyone can feel it, but nobody is willing to name it directly. Field guys who'd never had a reason to stop by my office found one. Denise, my scheduler of 9 years, brought me coffee on the second Monday, something she had never once done in 9 years, and set it on my desk, and left without saying anything. She didn't need to. Wendell, the electrician who'd caught my eye in the warehouse, stopped by on the last Wednesday and said he wished me well. He said it the way people say something they actually mean. Marcus started showing up at my office with a legal pad. I want to say something honest about this, because it matters. I answered every question Marcus asked me. I walked him through the renewal calendar, the escalation procedures, the vendor relationships that required personal attention. I did it completely and without editorializing. Whatever happened between me and my father-in-law, I wasn't going to leave the operation in disarray for the people who depended on it. That wasn't who I was, and I wasn't going to let this change who I was. But there were 2 things I didn't hand over, because they were never Ellison's to receive. The first was the compliance tracking system. No one asked about it specifically. Marcus understood, in a general way, that our documentation was well organized. He didn't understand that the organization was a function of a specific tool I had built on personal equipment, licensed under my personal account, that would stop running for Ellison the moment I transferred the license to Cornerstone. I wasn't going to explain this unprompted. It wasn't theirs. It had never been theirs. The second was the nature of my letters to the county and state contacts. On my last Friday, Marcus stopped by around 3 in the afternoon and asked if I'd be willing to put together a brief introduction email he could send to the key public sector contacts, just to let them know about the transition and that he'd be their new point of contact going forward. I told him I'd get him the contact information, which I did: names, office emails, main lines, all of it documented in the contact sheets I'd maintained, all of which was technically company information and which I handed over completely. What I didn't mention was that the county facilities director had replied to my letter 2 weeks earlier saying she looked forward to continuing the working relationship. What I didn't mention was that the state contract manager had flagged a potential compliance question about the management transition that Marcus was going to need to address within 30 days or risk a technical default finding. What I didn't mention was that these people already had Paul's company information and were already wondering whether the transition meant they should be updating their own renewal plans. I wasn't destroying anything. I just wasn't carrying anyone's water anymore. I packed my office on that last Friday afternoon in a single cardboard box. The blue binder went in first. A photo from my wife's birthday 2 years ago, the 3 of us, my wife and our daughter and me, sitting on the back porch in the late September light, my daughter in a Clemson sweatshirt she'd worn for about 6 months straight after she got her acceptance. She was finishing her junior year now. The partial scholarship her grandfather had mentioned, offhandedly, at Thanksgiving dinner 3 years running and had never once followed up on, we'd stopped waiting for it about 18 months ago. We were covering the rest ourselves. It was a stretch, but it was clean money. I took one last look out the window at the equipment yard. The service vans lined up along the fence, the material storage containers, 17 years of work organized into a physical space I had no claim on. Then I walked out to the parking lot, put the box in my trunk, and drove toward Durham. Marcus started making calls the following Monday. My first week at Cornerstone felt like adjusting to a different altitude. The work was the same work: public contracts, compliance cycles, client relationships, the operational mathematics of moving people and materials on deadline, but the air pressure was different. Nobody copied the owner on emails about my decisions. Nobody introduced me to a client contact with a qualifier that re-established my distance from the family. When I said something in a meeting, people wrote it down and then acted on it. Paul gave me a real office, door, nameplate, A window that looked out over the parking lot, which sounds like nothing and was not nothing. I spent the first month listening before talking. That's what you do when you come into an operation you didn't build, you map it before you move it. I identified several inefficiencies in the first 3 weeks that had been costing Cornerstone real money on their public contract work. Not dramatically, just consistently, the way small misalignments compound over years. In week 5, I began the formal process of integrating the tracking system into Cornerstone's operations. Paul's team had handled the acquisition cleanly, exactly as he described over breakfast. Documented, fair valuation, my name on the filing. It wasn't a life-changing number. That wasn't why it mattered. It mattered because for the first time in my professional life, something I had built was officially, legally, on paper, mine and then mine to transfer, on terms I had negotiated, to people who understood what it was. By the end of the second quarter, Cornerstone's compliance documentation scores on active public contracts had improved enough that Paul included the numbers in our bid package for a county-wide mechanical and electrical services agreement covering 38 municipal buildings across Durham and Wake counties. The contract value was $11 million over 4 years. Ellison Mechanical submitted a competing bid. I knew Ellison's numbers better than Marcus did. I knew their cost structure, their current labor overhead, the specific weak points in their northern county coverage that had been a problem since we'd added that territory 3 years earlier. I didn't use any of that information in our bid. I built Cornerstone's proposal on Cornerstone's actual capabilities, and Cornerstone's actual capabilities running on better systems, with better documentation, and with a senior VP whose name the county facilities director already knew and already trusted, were genuinely stronger. The county awarded the contract to Cornerstone. 3 weeks after the announcement, my cell phone rang. Area code 919. A number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. It was Marcus. He left a message that was nearly 5 minutes long. The short version. 2 of Ellison's public contract renewals were in jeopardy. A compliance issue had surfaced with the state office that he was having trouble resolving. The county facilities director hadn't responded to his last 2 emails, and he was wondering if I'd be willing to consult on a few things, informally, just a couple of conversations, off the record, to help him understand what he was dealing with. He said my father-in-law didn't know he was calling. He said he'd really appreciate it. I listened to the message twice, sitting in my car in the Cornerstone parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon. Then I called him back. I told Marcus I was glad to hear from him, and that I was available for consulting work on a formal basis. My current rate for external compliance and contract consulting in the public sector was $375 an hour, billed in 90-minute minimums, with a 3-session retainer required before scheduling began. I told him I could have a service agreement drafted within the week if he wanted to move forward. He said he'd have to check on a few things. He would get back to me. He didn't get back to me. My father-in-law left 4 voicemails over the following 6 weeks. Each one was a variation on the same structure, something about consulting arrangements, something about the importance of institutional relationships, something about what a long shared history was worth. The 4th one had a tone the first 3 didn't. He used the word loyalty in the second sentence and again near the end, like he was trying to see if it still worked. I sat with that word for a day and a half. 17 years of early mornings and late compliance reviews and Saturday calls from project managers with problems that couldn't wait for Monday. 17 years of client relationships built on my credibility, my consistency, my name, deposited quietly into an account that had someone else's name on the outside. If that wasn't loyalty, I didn't have a better word for it. And if it was, then my father-in-law had received 17 years of it without ever once asking what it cost. I called him back on a Sunday morning. He picked up quickly. He started talking before I could say anything about the business, about the difficulty of the current moment, about what things had looked like before I left, and how different they were now. He talked for several minutes. I let him finish. Then I said, "Don, you ran a solid operation for a long time. I know that. But you made a decision in November about what the company was and who it belonged to. I heard you. I just decided to act on the same information." I told him I wished him well. I meant it. I hung up. About 4 months later, I heard through the regional contractor network the kind of information that moves through industry contacts the way weather moves, without anyone sending it directly, that Ellison Mechanical had lost the state facilities service agreement at renewal, that the county school contract had been rebid and awarded to a larger regional firm, and that my father-in-law was in conversations with a private equity group about a partial sale. I didn't follow the details. I didn't need them. What I know is this. At the ABC Regional Excellence Awards dinner that spring, Cornerstone Building Systems was recognized for public sector contract performance and the operational improvements we'd posted over 12 months. Paul said a few words, then introduced me as the person responsible for building the systems behind the numbers. I shook some hands, talked shop with people who already knew the work and asked good questions about it. My name was in the program, on the award plaque, on the federal bid documentation that was being prepared for a regional DOT infrastructure project that Cornerstone was positioned to win. My wife drove down for the dinner. She sat next to me during the reception in a dark green dress I hadn't seen in a couple of years, and she had the look of someone who had made a difficult decision a long time ago and had finally arrived at a place where she didn't have to keep making it again. On the drive home, she told me our daughter had accepted a research fellowship for the fall semester. I told her that wasn't a surprise to me, because the kid had always been smarter than I was in ways I couldn't fully track. She called the next morning to tell me about it herself, and mentioned that she'd seen my name in a LinkedIn article about the Cornerstone contract win, and said in the tone of a 21-year-old who was being generous with her praise, "That's actually kind of impressive, Dad, in a very niche way." I'll take it. We paid her tuition ourselves, all 4 years. Some of it was tight. None of it came from a promise made at a dinner table that was never written down and never meant to be kept. Here's what I want to leave you with, because I've had almost 2 years now to think about it clearly. I spent 17 years running an operation inside a structure that was not designed to recognize what I was doing, not because the work wasn't visible. The work was extremely visible. Every contract, every compliance score, every client relationship, it was visible to everyone. It just wasn't credited, because credit inside a family structure flows to the family, and I was always, in the final accounting, the one who had married in. I'm not carrying bitterness about that. Bitterness would mean regretting the work, and I don't regret the work. The work was real. The systems ran clean. The contracts were sound. You can be proud of something you built without needing the person who benefited from it to acknowledge that you built it. But here is what I know now that I wish I had understood clearly on year 1 instead of year 17. You need to know exactly what you own, not what you've contributed to, not what you've been permitted to use or take credit for in the room. What is yours legally, documentably, provably yours? Your professional credentials, your direct client relationships, the systems you built on your own time, on your own equipment, before you knew you'd need to account for them, your name in the right clause of the right contract. Document it, date it, maintain it. Keep copies somewhere that isn't their server in their archive. Understand the difference between your contributions to their asset and your own actual leverage, because those are not the same thing, and in the moment, you need to know the difference. There will not be time to figure it out. And when the day comes, and in a family business, the day almost always comes, don't leave angry. Angry means rushed. Angry means incomplete. Angry means you walked out before you understood what you were actually carrying. Leave prepared. Leave with the relationships documented, the systems accounted for, and a clear understanding of which contracts have your name and which clauses and what that means. That's when everything changes. Not when you decide to leave. When you leave knowing what you built was always yours, that you were just keeping it somewhere else for a while.